I have never worked on a project where we didn't need to manage files the one way or the other. And when it comes to managing and storing files, Azure Blob Storage is a go-to definitely. So in this video, I will show you everything you need to know to get from zero to hero with Azure Blob Storage and your .NET application. Hey there and welcome to the Code Wrinkles channel. The Microsoft Azure Storage platform is a very versatile solution when it comes to storing data objects in the cloud. And I have used the word data objects because actually we can use different types of data to store in the Azure Storage. And therefore the Azure Storage platform provides us different services to work with different types of data. And the main services are the blob storage, which obviously is used for storing blobs or files usually. Then we have the table storage that is used to store tabular data. Then we have the Azure Queue storage that helps us when we need very lightweight queue messaging communication. And last but not least, we also have Azure File Shares, which, as the name implies, gives you the opportunity to create your file shares directly in Azure. I could create an entire course on Azure Storage capabilities, but in this one I would like to keep everything very concise and we will concentrate only on Azure Blob Storage. So Azure Blob Storage is optimized to store massive amounts of unstructured data. As developers, most of the time we use this for storing files. To get started with almost all storage services in Microsoft Azure, we have a central control plane that we call a storage account. So let's create one. I have already created a resource group for this video, so I will go on in this resource group and we will create a storage account here. Let's search for storage and let's choose the storage account and then create. And here we will have to walk through some wizards, some steps where we will have to make some choices that might affect the way that our storage account works, and we will discuss this in a lot more detail. Now, the first thing that we need to provide is a storage account name, then the region. I will just leave it as it is for now, just to not spend a lot of time on that. Then performance, here is also a basic decision or choice between standard and premium. Obviously, premium is a little bit more expensive than the standard one, and for a lot of scenarios, even production scenarios, standard is just okay. Now, the other point that we have to choose here is redundancy. And here we see that we have this dropdown and we have these four options like locally redundant storage, geo-redundant storage, zone redundant storage, and geo-zone redundant storage. Now, I wouldn't like to really get into detail into what each of these options mean because I think they also have a very explicit description here, and I will go with this one. I would just want to say that when you are working with Azure Blob Storage and the storage account for your production applications, just make sure to understand what exactly the data storage requirements are from your customer or from your company, and choose here a redundancy, a strategy that is in accordance with the requirements that you have. So I will just leave this one for now. So let's go to the next one, and here we have some checkboxes. Some of them are already checked, some are unchecked. And here I will leave everything like it is for now. Basically what we have here are some options regarding if we want to have only HTTPS, and that's surely something that we want. We want to have to be able to kind of like use access keys. We want to also enable public access. That's actually a very important point because in some scenarios you might want in web applications to use URLs from your blobs directly in image URLs. And in that case, of course, that this checkbox also needs to be checked. Now I will leave everything else exactly like it is right now, and I will go one step further. And here we have some settings for the blob storage, and some of them are unavailable to change because we haven't chosen that premium version of that. And then allow cross-tenant migrations. That's for instance, if you want to transfer data from one storage account that belongs to one tenant to one organization to a different organization. I will leave this checkbox like it is right now. And here the access tier. That's also a very nice thing because you can choose here hot. This is for frequently used data. So data that you access very frequently, or cool, which like for data that you access a little bit more infrequently. And that's actually also another way to, or this is also another way to kind of like optimize the cost of your Azure services. Now let's click next and go to the networking. Here with this enable network access, here I would also like to choose enable public access from all networks. Then for the routing, let's use the Microsoft routing. We don't want to get into very complicated stuff here. Now, here there are some other options regarding data recovery. I will also leave here all the defaults that are checked and also those that are unchecked. And let's click next on encryption. By default, we have an encryption at rest here, and Microsoft does encrypt our data, but if we want to bring our custom key for encryption, we can definitely do that. Next, tags, that's something that I will skip, and then there is this general review, and once everything is reviewed and all the details are there, what we can do is just click here on this create, and this storage account will be created. Cool. Now that everything is done, let's click on go to resource, and here we are at our storage account. And one very important thing that you'll see here is you see that here we have containers, file shares, queues, and tables. So it's exactly what we have discussed earlier, that Azure Storage actually offers us a lot of different capabilities or services. However, before we go further, I would just like to look into two very important things and note them down because they will be important just a little bit later. First of all, just make sure that you copy this storage account name and that you store it somewhere safe, because we will need this in our .NET application. And then the other thing that we will need is to be able to connect from our .NET applications to our Azure Storage account. And for this, we will use some access keys. So I will go here on the access keys, and here on the key 1, we'll click on show and copy. So we copy the access key, then hide again. Make sure you save it somewhere, because once again, we will need it in our .NET application. Now that we have an Azure Storage account, the next logical thing is to connect to our storage account programmatically from our .NET/C# application. To achieve that, we have actually 3 options, and I want to very briefly describe them, because they are very important. So first off, we can connect, or we can use Azure Active Directory to get access to our storage account. Now, this is a very nice thing to do, because in order to be able to do this, you would need to create a service principal in Azure Active Directory, and then you would use that service principal to be able to get access to your storage account. So it's very similar to when you register applications in Azure Active Directory for your API. And in fact, this would also mean that you would need to register your console or your application that wants to use the storage account as an application. The second option that we would have is to use what it is called a shared access keys. Now, shared access keys are very nice because they allow us to give very granular permissions and access to only specific locations or specific parts of the storage account to specific people and for a specific time frame. The last option is to use what we generally call keys. Now, the easiest way to connect to our Azure Storage account is obviously using the regular keys. However, I want to note that this is probably the most insecure approach. So when you want to do this in your production application, you need to make sure that your keys are really secure. They shouldn't be stored in app settings.json or in constants or anywhere actually where that you would commit to source control. They need to be managed probably with some key vault or something like that. So you need to be very careful when you are using that. However, for simplicity's sake, because in this video I really want to concentrate only on working with the Azure Blob Storage, we will use this third approach with the regular keys to connect to our storage account. But let me know if you want to have a more in-depth video on these different options that we might have to connect to different Azure services programmatically, like Azure AD, shared access keys, and the regular keys. And if I have 50 comments on this video that would request such a video, I promise you I will create it. To connect our .NET application to our Azure Storage account and to Azure Blob Storage and to work with the container that we have created, first of all, you would need to install a NuGet package that I have already installed, and that NuGet package is Azure Storage Blobs. And if you have installed the package, then you can go to the next step. As we'll be doing a lot of stuff today, I will create a new class dedicated to what we want to do here, and I will call this class Azure Blob Service. Okay, and here we have this class. To be able to connect, as said, we will use the regular access keys, and for that we also need the storage account. And I have told you that we want to note this information because we want to add this information as private fields in this class. So first of all, let's add the storage account name, and then let's also add the key. And then the last thing that we need is that blob service client. Obviously we'll need here to import some missing references. And now that we have all this information, let me create a constructor, and in the constructor I will use all this information that we have here to instantiate a new instance of this blob service client. So what we'll end up having is something like this, where we have these credentials, and for this we have this storage shared key credential, for which we need to specify the storage account and the access key that we have actually from our Azure portal. And then we also need to provide a blob URI that contains also our storage account name. So that's why we use this also here. And with these two pieces of information, we can create an instance of this blob service client. Now, as we have the instance, the next thing that we would like to do obviously is understand how we can connect, or if we are able to connect, and for instance just list all the available containers to see that the connection works. I will create here a new method that would be public. It would be async task, and we'll call this list blob containers async. And I will just copy this because I will use this name later. And here we have var containers, and we have here blob service client. And here with the blob service client, we can get the containers async. And then we iterate through this iAsync enumerable. And for each container, we just want to display the name. So if we go back here to our program class, let's move this console readline at the end. And the first thing that we want to do here is to create a new instance of the service. So var service equals new Azure blob service. So it's the one that we have worked on earlier. And having this, we would be good to go. And then what we can do is just simple service list blob containers async, and then we would be good to go. Obviously, this is an async method, so let's also await it. And now what we can do obviously is run the application and prove that everything works correctly. And voila, here is the name of the only container that we have created. So our connection to our storage account and to our containers is okay, so we can move forward. Before we can get started with uploading file to Azure Blob Storage, we need to get familiar with the overall architecture. And this is important because the overall architecture also is visible in the Azure Blob SDK that we will use, and we need to understand that. So first of all, we have this storage account, which is the central control plane that we already have. Then we have the concept of containers. You can think about a container just like being a folder in which you want to upload or you want to place some files. But then we have these regular blobs, and when we say blob, actually that we usually or most oftenly think about files. Now this is important because this exact scenario is also recreated in the SDK. So what we have in the SDK is a blob service client, and we can use this blob service client to create a blob container client, and this is a client that helps us to manage and to work with the containers. Now if we want to work with blobs, we can use the blob container client to create an instance of a blob client, and that blob client will actually help us achieve what we want, so uploading or managing blobs or files to Azure Blob Storage. To spice things up, let's start to upload files to our Azure Blob container. And I will use here this method, and obviously I will explain it step by step because it's based on what we have described earlier. So the idea is that what we will return in the end is a list of the URIs of the blobs or the files that we upload to our Azure Blob Storage. And this is obviously useful because consumers that kind of like want to upload files to Azure Blob, probably they will also want to know exactly the URI where those files will be uploaded. So that's why we create this list of URI first. And then we have here the file path for a file that I have already pre-created. Here is this hello.txt. And then what we do here is exactly what we described earlier. So first of all, we have the blob service client. That is something that we already have on our field. And based on this blob service client, we can use it to create a container. Basically not to create a container, but create a container client for the files container that we have already listed. And as we have a blob container client, the next step is to create a blob client from that container client. And here, that's exactly what we do in this method here. Now there is a little bit of discussion here going on because Azure Blob Storage by default doesn't have the concept of hierarchical data. It only has the concept of flat data. Still, we can kind of like use virtual directories, like directory that we create virtually based on the naming that we have, or based on the names or the structure of the file path that we give. So the idea is that my file name, it's obviously hello.txt, but I want this file to be in a virtual folder or virtual hierarchical folder that is called today. So that's why I have created this today, and here then this / and then the file path. And as we will see just in a few seconds, this will result in the fact that on the Azure Blob Storage, if we go to the portal, we'll be able to see this as a folder. And then what we also want to do to see that kind of like this works and that they are two different locations means that we have to create an additional blob client, because I want to upload the same file also with a subfolder or to a subfolder that is called tomorrow. So in that case, those two will be two different blobs. So even if we have the same physical file on the file system, they are two different blobs. And once we have all those two blob clients, we use them one by one and we just upload the file to our blob. Now, when we upload async, there is this important part which see this through here. And what we need to specify here is usually the file path where we have the physical file that we want to upload. And then if we want to override if that file already exists or not. And the thing is that if we set this to true, obviously it will override an existing file that's exactly the same. However, if we have this to false and we have already that file uploaded, or we have the exact same blob, this will result in an exception being thrown. So a little bit careful with this one. And then we do exactly the same thing also for the second one, also making sure that we have this override to true, because we will run this application several times during this video. So I will want to overwrite it every time. And then what we do is we simply return these blob URIs. And obviously what we can do here, we can go back in the program.cs, and what we can do here is await and say service.upload async, and that's it. Obviously we could assign this to a variable and then iterate through that list and then specify and then list in the console all the URLs of those files. But for now, we will just skip that. So let's run the application. And now that the application has completed, let me go over to this Azure Blob Storage and let me go back to my containers. And if we go here to these files containers, you will see that we have these two folders. But once again, these are let's kind of like logical folders, virtual folders. They don't really exist at the storage level. And here in this today, we see that we have this hello.txt. And then also in this tomorrow, we also have this error.txt. hello.txt. So you see that we have uploaded the same file, but in Azure Blob Storage, we have actually two different blobs. Like the file itself is the same, but we have two different blobs. Like the file was uploaded twice, let's say. Now we have a bunch of files in our Azure Blob Storage, and one other very common scenario is that we need to list all the files, or the file names at least. To showcase the difference between hierarchical and flat listing of the blobs, I will add here two different methods, and obviously we'll go through them. The first one is this get flat blob async. And here what we do here is, well, as previously, we just get a blob container client, and then for the blob, we get all the blobs async. And here, the only thing is that you see that the return type of this get blobs async is an async pageable of blob item. So it's also an async enumerable, and that's why we also have this await for each. Now the idea is that then we iterate through all the blobs, and for each blob we want to display obviously the name of the blob, which is the file name. And once again, please note here the return type that we have from this method, which is a blob item. Now, if we want to display this hierarchically, we do exactly the same things. The only thing is that we have here this get blob by hierarchy async method on the blob container. And if we take a look at what this returns, this is actually a blob hierarchy item. So the previous one was a blob item, and this is a blob hierarchy item. Now in the blob hierarchy item, you have a little bit more information and context. For instance, if this is a prefix, that will kind of like see if you are currently in a logical folder or virtual folder. Indeed, in that case, we just want to, well, console writeline this specific folder. And then we want to recursively call the same method again to kind of like get all the information that we have in a certain hierarchy. And if it is not a prefix, then we obviously just want to write the blob name. Now, for this method to work properly, obviously, you need to have at least several different hierarchies, and you need to have at least several different files or different blobs in each virtual or logical folder. Otherwise, what we'll end up having is something pretty flat also, but it will still help us enough to actually get an understanding on how that works. So let me go back to this program file, and first of all, let's call service.getFlatBlobsList async and await service.get hierarchy blobs list async. Also, let's add the console.writeLine here. That would kind of like be something similar to this one, just to know exactly, or to have a better overview for where exactly we have this one and when exactly we will have this one. And let's run the application. And we see the result here. This time, as said, here we have this flat version and here we have this hierarchy version. Now, the only thing is that due to the fact that we had only one single file in each hierarchy, we see it exactly the same way. Last but not least, a very common scenario is to delete blobs or to delete files. So let's do that. Deleting a blob is obviously something very easy compared to what we have done before, and it could be accomplished by using something like that. So once again, we have the file name that we want, and we need to create a blob container client, and then based on the blob or from that blob container client, we need to create a blob. And then what we want to do is we want on the blob await delete if exists async. Now, what I want to show you here is that you have here different ways to delete. You have the delete async and the delete if exists async. Obviously, the delete async, if it doesn't find a file, it will throw an error. But then the delete if exists async, then if it exists, it will delete the file. If it doesn't exist, it will simply just ignore everything and don't perform any action. So to wire everything up here together, we can then just go here to our program and await.services or service.delete async, and that would be good to go. That's it. Now you have all the tools that you need to start working with Azure Blob Storage in your .NET applications. This being said, thank you very much for watching, and if you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button so that you help others discover it more easier. And if you are for the first time on this channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you are always notified when we have new content on this channel. And if you have a question or if you just want to get a discussion going, don't be shy and head over to the comment section of this video and leave your comment, and I would be more than happy to get in touch with you. This being said, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.